Good morning. My name is Clark Miller, and I am a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation Society at Arizona State University. And in our last video, we talked about disciplines and professions as communities who have particular ways of knowing. And so what we want to do in today's video is to look at how knowledge making differs from discipline to discipline, just to give you an example of what it means for different ways of knowing to be kind of organized and structured differently. So I want to start just with that definition from the previous video of a discipline or a profession as a formalization of training and practice in a particular community around a particular body of knowledge and a particular way of knowing. And just go back and also remind you from a previous video that we had talked about the different elements of a way of knowing. So we talked about epistemology as the question of how we know, what are our methods, what are our forms of evidence, what are our styles of reasoning. We talked about ontology, meaning what is it that we know about, what are the objects that we know about in a particular way of knowing. We talked about the contents of that way of knowing, the uncertainties, the forms of uncertainty, the ways that we express uncertainty in relationship to those contents. We talked about standards, meaning the values, what we value when we're making knowledge, how we differentiate between things that we think rise to the level of knowledge and what we don't think rise to the level of knowledge, for example. And we talked about structures and flows. So we talked about the organizations, the institutions, the social practices and processes that are involved in a particular way of knowing, right? So just to remind you of the elements of a way of knowing. And so now I want to take those elements and think a little bit about, well, look at some examples of how disciplines differ, right? So when we talk about disciplines here, right, we're talking about chemistry, physics, biology, we're talking about history, anthropology, right? These different departments of a university into which we've divided up the business and the practice of knowing formally within context, sometimes called invisible colleges, if you will, right? So those departments, those disciplines have different ways of knowing, and those different ways of knowing have different features, characteristics, elements. So, for example, they ask different kinds of questions, right? So this is an example of epistemology and ontology. So in the biological sciences, for example, we ask, how does nature work? How do natural systems function? And we investigate the elements, right, of those natural systems, the materials, the biochemistry, the cells, the organisms, and how they interact with one another in food webs, for example, right? So we're understanding nature, natural systems and processes and how they work, right? But in the social sciences, we explore how social systems work. We tend not to ask about nature so much in the social systems, unless it's about how people conceptualize nature, right? How they relate to nature, how they organize themselves around food resources, for example, right? So we investigate individuals, households, markets, institutions, right? Features of our social worlds and how they interact and how they work. And then in the humanities, we explore ideas by investigating what is meaningful to people, right? So we ask questions about, like this one, how do we behave ethically toward our neighbors during a pandemic? Big idea, ethics, right? The ethics, what are the ethical norms that should guide our behavior? How do we reason about how we should behave ethically as individuals in a community, right? What are those big ideas that should guide human behavior, human history, and so forth? So likewise, in addition to asking different questions, we look for different kinds of evidence. So in chemistry and physics, we do a lot of experiments. And the evidence for answering questions typically comes from the results of those experiments, the data, the analyses that we get from our experimental machineries and our experimental processes, right? In fields like demography, which is a subfield of sociology, for example, by contrast, we look at statistical databases, or in economics, we look at a lot of statistical databases. Political scientists use a lot of statistical databases too that describe different populations, right? And the characteristics of those populations. And then in fields like history, the evidence that we look at comes from documents from the past, right? The documentary record of people who did things in previous generations, because they want to know what those people did, how they thought about it, and in order to do that, they got to get what they call primary materials, right? Materials that are from those people, written by those people, that describe those people in their own time, in their own words, right? So different, very different kinds of evidence. In all three cases, evidence that we might call empirical evidence, right? Evidence of stuff happening in the world, but acquired in very different ways. Digging in archives, building and conducting experiments, collecting large statistical databases. Those questions, that evidence, are interpreted in very different conceptual ways as well, right? So we think about models as an important scientific tool, but if you look at different disciplines, the very idea of a model is different. It's used differently, it's constructed differently, right? So in physics, when we talk about models, one of the things physicists like to do is to construct very simplified models of how parts of the universe work. And so, for example, you can see in this picture on the left, the idea of a particle in a box, right? And how you can begin to derive understandings of, for example, electrons and how electrons behave by understanding and theorizing how a particle might behave in a box. A single particle might behave if you put it in a box, right? So it's an idealized physical model, right? In biology, we also create models. We create model organisms, which are standardized, in this case, mice. So you create hundreds, thousands, millions of mice who are all genetically identical to each other, so that you can conduct experiments in highly standardized sets, in highly standardized organisms in this particular case, so that you can learn the behavior of biological systems by exploring how these model systems work. And then in climate science, for example, we build models, we build computer simulations. So we build something like a model organism, except we build it using computational routines that are designed to solve mathematical equations that allow us to model the behavior of complex systems that we could never conceptualize in our head the way we do an idealized particle in a box model, nor could we build a representation of that complex system the way we build a model organism, right? So the very idea of a model and how a model works is kind of similar across the three, but it has very different characteristics, very different implementation, and very different epistemic impacts in these three different disciplinary areas. The organization of ways of knowing within a discipline is different. So, for example, what is the space in which you do your work, right? So in chemistry and physics, we do it in laboratories. And so the people are confined to a particular space, but inside that space, we're able to construct experimental apparatuses and experimental tools that allow us to explore phenomena that we can't explore outside the laboratory because we don't have those same capabilities, right? But we control the entire space in order to do experiments in it, right? But in fields like ecology, you can do some of that, but you can't, a lot of it, you have to actually go to where the ecosystem is, because we can't recreate the ecosystem in a laboratory. So we have to go to field sites, and we do work in the field, right? And taking people to the field and organizing knowledge making in a field is very different than organizing in a laboratory, because there's all kinds of things you can't control in the field, right? And it's away from a lot of your instrumentation. It's away from your computers. And so it's a different kind of social organization. It's a different kind of epistemic organization. Then in a field like anthropology, where we also similarly have to go to the field, but you don't take a team in anthropology. You go by themselves, right? It's this book that I found the cover of from Anthropology, The Lone Ethnography, but it's absolutely correct, right? Knowledge is made by individual researchers, and they go out into the field and they immerse themselves in that social environment of a village or a community, and they explore what it's like to live in that social system, if you will, but they do it by themselves, right? So we organize knowledge making in teams, in the sciences, by individuals in the social sciences, but those teams are different in physics and chemistry than they are in ecology because of the difference between laboratories and field sites, and so forth. Communicate. How do we communicate knowledge? Well, in some sense, all scientists are supposed to write down their knowledge and communicate it, but they do it differently. It's interesting. In a lot of fields, you see journal articles as the primary instrument for communicating scientific knowledge. So the idea is that it needs to be peer reviewed and published in a journal. In other fields, like on the right, which is anthropology as an example, people generally publish. They're more rewarded if they publish books. The sense is that you can't get enough depth, you can't get enough content, you can't get enough of an exposure to really understand a community, right? Think about trying to understand the social dynamics and social behavior of a whole community. You can't really do that in a 10-page journal article. You got to have enough space, you got to have enough words to describe that requires an ethnography, that requires a book, right? One of the interesting developments recently in physics is that, especially in certain areas of physics where there's kind of a privileging of really being on the cutting edge and high level competition between researchers who are out at that very cutting edge. And so they've actually developed now this idea of a preprint archive. So now you publish the thing long before it ever appears in a peer-reviewed journal. You're publishing the insights, the key insights ahead of time, so that one, you can get credit for them, and two, you can share those ideas earlier, because journals might take 6 months, and 6 months is too long if in these extremely high, rapidly moving fields. And so physicists have taken to looking mostly in these preprint archives, and that creates interesting dynamics around peer review, for example, and what happens if peer review results in ideas being shared that ultimately later the peer reviewers say, well, we're not really convinced these are the right ideas, right? So you see the tensions between these different ways of communicating knowledge. Employment in these different ways of knowing is different. So in engineering, for example, PhD students are funded on external grants. In the humanities and social sciences, by contrast, PhD students are funded on teaching assistantships. It creates very different political economy. right? So in engineering, the PhD students are doing work that's essentially determined by federal science funding agencies and their choices about what kind of research we should do. By contrast, in the social sciences and the humanities, it's departments who control the teaching assistant lines, and they give the teaching assistant lines to the students who are doing the most interesting work. And so they control the discipline, controls more the question of what are the most interesting questions, what gets focused on in PhD research. And it feels like biology and chemistry, it's a mix. And the students end up having to often to do both. And so, you know, a question of how do you do that? How do you keep that going? How do you make sure everybody has funding in your department and so forth, right? Raises different kinds of questions. So to sum up, disciplines may look similar from the outside. We may think of them as, you know, oh, look, they've all got departments, they've all got professors, they've all got PhD students. But when you look in detail at how those institutions work and the kinds of ways of knowing that they develop and how they know within those ways of knowing, you see that they operate very differently from one another. So with that, thank you very much. And I will see you in the next video.